Well, it's my great pleasure to be here with Dan Turello, whom I got to know last year, and I have had the opportunity to read his marvelous new book, which is coming out from Columbia University Press. It's called Connections: How Technology Can Make Us Better Humans. So, it's got a great subtitle, and the book as a whole gives us a lot of things to think about. There was a preview piece of part of the book in the New Yorker magazine last month that you can catch called The Robot and the Philosopher. Dan himself is a man of many talents. He's an author, photographer, cultural historian. He has a PhD from Harvard in Romance languages and literature, and he's a political theorist as well as an intellectual historian. All of that is in the book that you'll see. All those qualities are in the book. And he's currently a Technology and Humanity Fellow at the Center for the Future of AI, Mind, and Society at Florida Atlantic University. So, in any case, welcome, Dan. So good to see you. So glad to be with you.
Great to see you, Tim. Thanks for that very gracious introduction, and thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. So, to start with a general question, I'm sure you've heard this question before, but we want to know the answers like why, what brought you about? How did this come about? What motivated you to write Connections? And from where I sit, and people know a little bit about Humanities Watch, my background in medieval and Renaissance studies. So you have that background too, and maybe I'm sure there's a line. I know there's a line between that background and your motivations to write the book. So just tell us a little bit more about how this book came about.
Yeah, so it's great because that we met in the context of talking about technology, and then realized that we had commonalities in terms of medieval and Renaissance studies. So let me tell you a couple of stories that I think will help put this in perspective. And this really goes back. This book has developed over a long period of time. The germ of it really goes back to graduate school, and then a lot of
Mm.
life happened in between, and a lot of iterations and writings and rewritings. But the story that I want to tell you is, during my time in grad school, I was reading Franciscan poetry. This is the
Mm.
second generation after Saint Francis of Assisi, a gentleman by the name of Jacopone from Todi, who was writing lauds and poetry. And as you know, as almost everyone knows, when you're deep in an academic subject matter, you always need to have an escape valve. And in that, it happens. It's human.
Yep.
And in that particular context, I happened to be watching the new Battlestar Galactica series.
Okay.
I think it first came out in 2005. It went through six
Mhm.
seasons. The first season is really fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I highly recommend it.
Uh-huh.
But the really short version is that in Battlestar Galactica, the Cylons, who are a race of AI robots, eventually revolt against their human creators. And the way they find their way back in to destroy the human fleet, they get the master codes to all of the mainframe defenses. The
Uh-huh.
one ship that survives is the Battlestar Galactica, and it survives because the commander was a bit of a Luddite. He had refused to network the Battlestar into the system. Everything on the ship was a standalone computer, and so when the Cylons destroyed the rest of the fleet, the Battlestar was saved. So I was watching this and thinking about Franciscan literature, and the Franciscans were one of the first counterculture movements in
Mhm.
early modern Europe. It was a massive movement, and they were really concerned with maintaining their autonomy from the bureaucratic mechanisms of the Roman Catholic Church. And
Mhm.
the parallels, I mean, we're talking 7 centuries apart. But it just struck me that there were some parallels there, and I started wondering, when did we first become afraid of technology as a system and technology developing a mind of its own and wanting to detach from that? So that was the original intuition, very
Uh-huh.
impressionistic. And I'll just tell you one more shorter story. A little bit later, I was in California, and I was spending time with friends in Santa Barbara. We went out to a bar one night, a club, and there was a local band playing. And the lead singer on stage had long hair and was singing about the military-industrial complex and world peace and everybody loving each other. And we talked after the show, and he asked me, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm writing about the Franciscans. And his eyes absolutely lit up, and he was like, "Oh, St. Francis. I mean, that's where it's at. He's the inspiration for all of us." So
Wow.
that
Yeah.
reconfirmed, if St. Francis, and I say this in the book, if St. Francis is still making appearances in offbeat California establishments, there's probably something there that's worth exploring, and that was the impetus to go that far back in history.
Well, those are beautiful stories about connections, right? I mean, that's exactly what your book's about. Drawing these connections. And another connection that occurred to me just last week was, of course, I'm sure you heard that we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of Francis's death this year, the churches, right? So this is a big year for the Franciscans. So you've timed your book perfectly with
Yeah, no, I love that. He's a
with
character that, yeah, he just always reappears, which is wonderful.
so I think like, one of the really interesting aspects of the book is your treatment of technology. And you and I were talking, before we sort of got on air here about the way people think about technology. And I think one of the great merits of your book is you take us into a depth dimension about that term. So maybe here, could you say a few words about how you're trying to help people understand technology in a more, let's say, more connected way, in a way that they may not have thought about it before?
When people hear that I'm thinking and writing about technology, they typically immediately assume that I am writing about social media. And
Mm,
I find this, I mean, it's makes perfect sense. It's what's on our mind these days. Social media and
mhm,
large language models are what gets most of the
mhm,
media attention. But my hunch, social media has only been around 20 years or so, and my wild prediction is that 100, 200 years from now, when historians look back, they will see it as this kind of weird, bizarre blip in the history of technology.
mhm,
It's almost a bit of a virus. It's something that we haven't quite gotten used to yet, but we're starting to. We're developing additional technology like blocks and ways of limiting our
mhm,
interactions with social media. We're seeing a lot of
mhm.
literature that looks at how dangerous it is for childhood development, and so we're
Right,
starting to
right.
to think about that. So all that to say, social media is interesting, but it's really just a really limited period of time. The way I'm thinking about technology itself is one of these terms like it's a really big and laden term, like freedom, like humanity, like individuality, like love. It's a term that has a lot of different meanings. It has evolved over time. In terms of its roots in the English language, the way we use technology now, which is typically as an application of science. So science comes up with its theories and its methods and its practices, and then technologies apply those and create devices and machines and apps and so on.
Mhm, mhm,
That particular usage of the term really goes back only to the 1860s when
mm.
with the naming of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Oh, okay.
Uh, but before that, it was, what we think of as technology was thought of as machines, as mechanical systems, as craft, various forms of craft, or more simply as materiality. And so when I think about technology, and I'll try to make this pithy, but I really go all the way back to the origins of history and think of anything that goes beyond the human body, the naked human body. And there's you know there's
Okay.
there's
Okay.
there's mythical and um the biblical record. You remember the Adam and Eve, when they were kicked out of the garden, the first thing they do is create, find fig leaves and then create
The
animal
fig leaf.
skins with
Yep.
which
Yep.
to
Right.
cover themselves. And that strikes me, that also ties into a tradition of German anthropology, and we can talk about that or not, but all of
Uh,
that history is in the book. But just the way of thinking of technology as a much more um, as a way of relating to the environment. So it really goes back much further than we might initially think.
Well, thank you. That sort of leads me to my next question, because you began by talking about how you were studying Jacopone de Todi, and you were reading this medieval Franciscan poetry. And one of the chapters that really caught my attention was when you begin talk you continue talking and talk more deeply about poetry, and you bring up these great Italian figures like Dante and Boccaccio. And you had a phrase there that I think we can maybe address. To be a great time maybe to address it now, given the context of everything you said. What you talked about, intimacy is technological isolation. And I think, like, wow, like, okay, say a little bit more about that, because here, this emotion, this feeling, this emotion of intimacy, of closeness, and how it can be you connect it to what you call technological isolation. And you do it in context of these great 13th and 14th century poets. So anyway, uh, I think I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. Let me try and do it
Okay.
very succinctly. The time period, we could go back even further, but the time period around when Dante was living, Dante was born in 1265, and he was writing the Divine Comedy in the first couple decades of the 14th century and the 1300s. And this was really a time of dramatic change for European society. And we saw the introduction of all sorts of mechanisms that we would recognize as being modern and even contemporary. So all of the beginnings of double entry accounting methods. You have the foundations of trade of that goes beyond national borders. So Italian merchants from city states were moving into France, and we're trading with North Africa. You have the establishment of the first insurance mechanisms. All of these
Yes.
mechanisms, all of these economic mechanisms that allowed for greater mobility and
Mhm.
greater movement of goods and of people. And what happened was that, and we see this throughout the comedy, Dante was very concerned with um, the mixing of people and new people coming into Florence, and
Right.
that flow of individuals disrupting city life, disrupting city patterns. So he really goes back. One of the images in the comedy is the image of the walls of Florence, and the
Mhm.
one of the ironies is that when Dante is talking about the walls of Florence and wishing that they were able to keep people out, in fact, they were not able to do that. And so, in his, technology as intimacy, it's really a double-edged sword there, because it's
Mhm.
on one hand, it's a protective mechanism, but you also see the roots of we could almost call it a certain level of tribalism and of fear of
Mhm.
folks who are coming from external geographies.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And it's there of course there's so many ironies in history, in that Dante is writing about this view of Florence when he himself is exiled from it, right? And he himself is mixing with other people in
Yeah,
order
yeah.
in order to
Against
survive.
against his will, but he certainly was. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think for readers, I mean, one of the joys of the book is you have this continuity of of this of carrying us through different moments in history, with this notion of how technology is, all in a sense, as you go back to Adam and Eve, it's always there, where it's always being used in different ways in our lives. And yet you're giving us also this dynamic of change. And you just mentioned one with Dante and Boccaccio. And if we zoom to the Renaissance, I mean, what I'm interested in is sort of the idea of watersheds. And you talk about the Renaissance as a watershed. You talk about the sculptor Goldsmith Cellini. Um, but you know, can you just say a few words about that moment as a watershed? And then, are we, of course, let's be a little more self-centered here. Like, are we, to what degree are we, do you think we are in a watershed moment also, in terms of our ability to to use technology or not use technology. Technology is sort of escaping our grasp. I think that's on everyone's mind right now.
Yeah, that's such a insightful question. Uh, Benvenuto Cellini was a sculptor, and he was, in the 16th century. And I think what's really remarkable about Cellini, he was working at the very highest levels. He was had commissions from the King of France and from the Pope and from a
Yeah.
long list of nobility. And but then he also, in addition to being a craftsman, he was also a writer, and he wrote an autobiography towards the end of his life. And what's remarkable about his autobiography is that it almost becomes a platform for promoting himself and his wares in a way that feels modern and almost contemporary.
Mhm.
He's
Okay.
talking about the value of his work. He's talking about how much effort he puts into it, and the degree of skill and the craft. And he's really, depicting this image of himself in a way to bolster his value as a human and as a craftsperson. And it feels like the foundation of everything that we're seeing today. It's cliche, but you go on Instagram and you see all sorts of people, everyone from artists to spiritual leaders to professors and teachers to health influencers and on and
Mhm.
on. And everybody, it goes back to what Stephen Greenblatt referred to as Renaissance self-fashioning. And that is, very, very much the spirit remains, I think, the spirit of the age. I think what is very different right now is just it's not so much the qualitative nature of it, but it's the speed at which we're moving. So our
Mhm.
feedback mechanisms are just so much faster. We have so much more awareness of how um, self-promotion and platforms and technological innovation is changing our way of life. So in some ways, we're just much more attuned and aware of the kinds of changes that are happening. Whereas in Cellini's age, he was practicing his art and writing his autobiography, but it really wouldn't be until later that historians would look back and say,
I
"Oh, this
see.
was really a defining moment in history." So yeah, to me, it's the speed of change that's really what's so um, distinctive about the current moment that we're in.
Yes, and as you suggest too, I think you talk you there's so many people you discuss in the book, and of course, in a short talk like this, we can't do justice to it. But you also engage a lot with contemporary philosophers and ideas of self-consciousness, and I think what you were also outlining for us is sort of this metacognition, as it were, like we're aware that the speed of things is happening so quickly. And we can maybe just conclude with one or two more questions. Um, there's a sentence that caught my attention towards the end of the book, and I'll quote it and then ask for your comment. It is not technology that will determine whether or not we are successful, but rather our choices around it. And, I think you've been pulling at that thread throughout our conversation, but since, as we move, sort of to a conclusion here, so could you just unpack that a little bit for us and comment a little bit more on it? Because again, I think with talks of the singularity and so on and AGI, I mean, there's this concern that things that we won't have choices. But you come down and you say, yes, we are agents still. We do have choices. So
Yeah, that's really one of the central themes of the book is coming
mhm,
back to that idea that it sounds very simple and almost cliche, but sometimes cliches develop for a reason and can
mhm,
be useful. But it's really this idea that we have agency. That's what defines human beings. We have choices. We can influence our environment, the way we relate to our neighbors and to society, and um, the prevailing sense these days is just that is it feels like technological determinism. So, the app
mhm,
made me do it. I
mhm,
you start scrolling and you spend 8 hours on Instagram or TikTok, and just the sense that the apps and the technologists are driving the picture. And I think that that is a risk. That is certainly a risk. But I really wanted to come back and by rooting in some of these humanist figures like Cellini and like others who are discussed in the book, really come back to elaborate and emphasize this idea that um, we've gotten to a place where we have greater agency over life and we have an ability to make choices, and we need to reclaim those. So
Mhm.
at its very core, that's what the book is about. It's about human beings and their choices, and less about technology.
Thank you so much. That I think the book so admirably sort of goes into that in so many different ways, from contemporary film to medieval Franciscans. It's really a treasure for anyone who is interested in this question, in the question really that we seem to think of, the question of our time, like how are we coming to terms with technology? So I urge everyone to read it. It'll be, as I said, it'll be out next month. And I just want to thank you again, Dan, for taking the time to sit down and have this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tim. It was wonderful to talk through these ideas with you.
Great. Okay. Thank you.